Hi everyone, this is your intrepid reporter Rob Gray standing again outside the Perception and Action Courthouse. Going on inside is a fascinating case. High variability has accused low variability of slander and making deceptive claims. This case will address the age-old question, is variability in movement a good or bad thing? So it's time for our call to action. Hi everyone. This is Rob Gray from Arizona State University and PerceptionAction.com. Welcome to the Perception and Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. Let's move inside the courthouse for the case of high versus low variability in movement control and motor learning. Order in the court. This case deals with the issue of variability in movement. First, we will hear from low variability, who will present the traditional view of this topic associated with the idea of motor programs. Next, we will hear from high variability, who will describe the more recent view on variability put forth in theories of complex systems and ecological dynamics. Low variability, please tell the court about the role variability plays in the control of movement and motor learning. Thank you, Your Honor. As we all know, movement is controlled by Generalized Motor Programs, or GMPs, which develop with practice and are stored in the higher areas in our central nervous system. GMPs fall into movement classes. The same GMP is used for movements which share common invariant features. These features, for example, sequencing, relative timing, and relative force, make up the movement plan. Notice here, these invariant features are all relative. So what we care about is whether or not the force in one muscle is 2 times greater than that in the other, not the individual or absolute forces of each muscle alone. Specific movements for a particular context are then generated via the pre-movement assignment of absolute parameters which are free to vary. For example, absolute force and absolute timing. These are stored in memory schema. As an example, think about a baseball pitcher making a pickoff throw to first base. Making a slow, deliberate throw to ensure the runner shortens their lead, and a quick snap throw trying to pick them off share a set of basic features. For example, the sequencing of muscle movements, the relative timing of when the foot is lifted off the ground and the arm begins moving forward, etc. On the one hand, to make a deliberate throw, the absolute timing is slower. So the movement, which still has the same relative parameters, gets stretched out temporally by using a longer absolute timing. On the other hand, for a quick snap move, absolute time gets compressed, resulting in a shorter movement time. So, the act of throwing has a general motor program that can be adapted for different situations. But how does a performer know how to set the movement parameters appropriately? During the early stages of skill acquisition, the performer must learn the relationship between the specified parameters, for example, the absolute force and timing, and the movement outcome, for example, the time the ball travels in the air. A process which is facilitated by letting them practice under variable practice conditions. For example, allowing the pitcher in our example to throw the ball from several different distances when learning the skill. So, for those of us who support the idea of the GMP, high variability in practice conditions is a good thing because it allows a learner to more quickly experience different combinations of movement parameters and their associated performance outcomes. Although, there is a bit of a caveat to this I will return to in a moment. But there are 2 other types of variabilities that we want to be low. The first is outcome or endpoint variability. How consistently does the ball hit the center of the first baseman's glove? How consistent is the ball speed on the throw? Because we're trying to learn a very well-prescribed action, we want our endpoints or outcomes to be highly consistent. In other words, low variability. Similarly, the goal of a performer should be to have low variability in the movements that produce this outcome. Because a GMP involves the pre-movement specification of absolute parameters such as force and timing, the best way to produce a consistent outcome is to have a consistent movement pattern. For example, we want a pitcher's front foot to always have the same landing location and their elbow angle to always be the same. In other words, success through repetition of the movement pattern. But how do we get there? During the early stages of learning, the variability in performance outcomes and the variability in movement patterns will of course be high. This is due to the combination of three sources of error. First, basic errors in the GMP. For example, using the incorrect relative timing, such as throwing the ball before the hips are rotated or the weight is fully shifted. Second, errors in parameter specification, including the inability to predict the parameters needed or applying the inappropriate ones, such as absolute force. In our pitching example, this would result in not throwing the ball hard enough to get to first base, of course. Finally, we have neuromuscular variability or noise. Motor learning involves the gradual reduction of variability in movement patterns and the resulting performance outcomes by reducing the first two sources of error, the GMP and parameter specification. The low-level neuromuscular noise is not correctable and is insensitive to practice. This is, of course, why even the most elite performers cannot produce the exact same movement over and over. Let's look at an example of how variability can be related to some motor learning concepts. Back in episode 18, the basic finding that too much extrinsic feedback can be a bad thing was discussed. It has been proposed that this occurs because frequent feedback produces excessive movement variability during practice, which we don't want. Withholding feedback, on the other hand, encourages repetition of the action, leading to more stable behavior. Think about learning the baseball pickoff move again. Imagine I was trying to teach you to throw the ball to first base at a velocity of exactly 70 miles per hour. If I were to provide you with speed feedback on every trial, it would likely lead to excessive pitch-to-pitch modifications in the action. If the radar gun said 71, you might try to use slightly less force next time. Then if it dropped to 69, you might add a little more force. The problem here is that this can lead to a performer constantly changing movement patterns in an attempt to eliminate random, uncorrectable variability. That is the third type I mentioned that results from neuromuscular noise. This constant correction of movement patterns prevents the development of a stable representation for the GMP in memory. This link between feedback and variability was demonstrated nicely in a study by Wolf and Schmidt, published in the Journal of Motor Behavior in 1994. In this study, participants were asked to make a simple arm movement while holding a lever. There were 3 different movement patterns. Before each trial, they were shown a visual representation of the target movement path as a waveform. Feedback was provided in the form of a trace of an actual movement superimposed on the target movement. This feedback was provided at 2 times, immediately after the last movement was completed, and what the authors called reminder feedback, which was presented just before the next trial began. The immediate feedback showed you how you did on the trial you just completed, while the reminder feedback showed you how you did the last time you performed the condition that was coming up next. There were 2 groups in the study, a blocked and a random group. The block group performed a bunch of trials of pattern 1, then did a bunch of trials of pattern 2, then did a bunch of trials of pattern 3. For them, the immediate and reminder feedback would be the same, since, for example, they just performed pattern 1 and we'd be doing that again next. The random group obviously alternated conditions, so maybe pattern 2, then 3, then 2 again, then 1, etc. and so on. For them, the immediate and reminder feedback would be different in most cases. So for example, if they just completed pattern 1 and then were going on to do pattern 3, the immediate feedback would show how they just did trying to move like pattern 1, while the reminder feedback would show how they did the last time they performed pattern 3, which could have been several trials ago. Wolf and Schmidt predicted that this reminder feedback for the random group would lead to excessive corrections, high variability, and worse learning. For comparison, there was also blocked and random groups that received no reminder feedback at all. There were 90 acquisition trials followed by immediate, 5-minute, and delayed, 1-day retention tests. The main performance measure was the root mean square, or RMS error, which takes into account both the precision and accuracy of the movement. What was found? First, it should be noted that as predicted by GMP theory, all groups decreased their RMS errors with practice. In other words, their movement outcomes became less variable. In terms of the group comparison, the random group that received no reminder feedback performed the best overall, replicating the basic motor learning finding that random practice is beneficial. The next best groups were the two blocked groups, who showed no difference in performance whether reminder feedback was provided or not. Finally, the random group that received the reminder feedback performed the worst, with the highest variability and the lowest accuracy. So, as predicted, providing too much feedback led to overcorrection of movement, and in this case, completely eliminated the benefits of random practice.
He must have long hair, be tall and broad shouldered with a sense for fashion, for night things and for fun who buy me roses. Always by the dozen, the very opposite of my husband.
High variability can also explain some of the pros and cons of using constant versus variable practice. A key thing we need to determine when teaching someone a new skill is whether or not both the GMP and the parameters need to be learned. For some actions, for example like throwing a ball or riding a bike, the performer may already have developed the GMP. Remember that this is a program for the relative components of the action. For example, the timing of when to contract your different muscles when pedaling a bike. In this case, they may need to only learn the absolute parameters for riding in different situations. For example, riding uphill versus downhill. The effect of constant and variable practice on GMP and parameter learning were investigated in an interesting study by Lay and colleagues in 2000. In this study, participants were asked to perform a key pressing task. GMP learning was investigated by imposing a relative timing structure. That is, performers had to learn to spend a particular ratio of time on each key. For example, press 2 times longer for key 2 than 4. Parameter learning was investigated by looking at 3 different absolute timing constraints. That is, performers were asked to complete all 4 key presses with a total movement time of either 700, 900, or 1100 milliseconds. A constant practice group which practiced only one of these absolute times was compared to a variable group that alternated between the 3. Performance was measured in both retention and transfer, that is, trying to execute a different movement time not done in training, conditions. What was found? In terms of relative timing, that is, learning the GMP for the task, participants in the constant practice outperformed those in the variable group. They had more accurate and stable relative timing. This again appeared to be related to movement variability. Changing the absolute timing in the variable practice condition resulted in movements that were more variable from trial to trial, interfering with the formation of a stabilized general motor program in memory. However, the story was of course different when looking at the transfer condition. As has been found in several previous studies, the variable group performed best. So in a nutshell, low variability in practice conditions, in other words constant practice, seems to be essential for GMP learning, while high variability in practice, what we typically call variable practice, benefits parameter learning, which is used to perform the basic skill in different contexts. This leads to the practical suggestion that a complete novice, who is learning both the GMP and the movement parameters, should be exposed to constant learning early in practice and variable conditions later on. Interestingly, this Lay et al. Study also found that the effects of variable practice on GMP learning could be partially offset by adjusting the feedback given to the learner, in particular by using what is called bandwidth feedback. This type of feedback involves using a qualitative response when the performance is within a certain range. For example, just saying correct or good when the movement time is within plus or minus 15% of the goal, and then using quantitative feedback when performance is outside this bandwidth. For example, showing the learner the exact movement time on the screen. In their study, Lay et al. Found that combining bandwidth feedback with variable practice conditions resulted in better relative timing performance during learning. This was most likely the case because giving only qualitative feedback for a range of outcomes would prevent the type of overcorrection, leading to high movement variability, I discussed a few moments ago. A final set of results that are relevant to this case is the almost ubiquitous finding in performance research that experts have lower movement variability than novices. For example, sticking to the example of baseball pitching, in a 2008 study, Fleissig and colleagues examined several different kinematic variables for baseball pitchers at 5 different levels, ranging from youth baseball all the way up to the major leagues. 11 variability measures were used, including the standard deviation of lead foot landing location, the standard deviation of knee flexion, and the standard deviation of external shoulder rotation. For 6 out of 11 of these variables, there was a significant effect of skill level, with players at higher levels having the lowest standard deviations. In other words, more expert pitchers produced more consistent pitching motions. Interestingly, this study also looked at relative timing variables. For example, the timing of the maximum angular velocity of the pelvis and the total elapsed time of the pitching delivery. For these relative variables, there was no significant effect of skill level, suggesting that the basic pitching delivery technique, or what we might call the GMP, does not explain the skill level difference. Rather, it's the ability to consistently produce the movements and vary the parameters appropriately for different situations. This is just one study, but for almost any type of skill you can think of, this pattern is observed. Decreasing kinematic variability at increasing levels of skill. Finally, as discussed back in episode 11, increased kinematic variability under pressure seemed to also be associated with choking effects. Related to these findings, another type of variability that should be low if we want the best performance is intersubject variability. That is, the difference in movement patterns between performers. Many studies have shown that skills can best be described by an expert model. For example, good baseball batters first look at X, then move their eyes to Y, then shift their weight to their back foot, etc. As described well in the theory proposed by Erickson and colleagues, the main goal of deliberate practice is to reduce any deviations between current behavior and this expert model of performance. This will lead to optimal performance and all experts in a particular domain having similar movement patterns. So, to conclude, Your Honor, research examining GMP theory has clearly shown variability in movement is a result of error or noise, and that high variability in movement is bad. Low variability is a hallmark of expert performers and is the result of a stable GMP that is well consolidated in memory. This is true both for variability within and between performers. The goal of practice should be to systematically reduce variability by giving appropriate, that is not too much, feedback, introducing variable practice conditions at the appropriate time, and reducing any deviations from the optimal expert model of the skill. Thank you, low variability. High variability, will you please now present your case? Thank you, Your Honor. My esteemed opponent in this case's description of how movement is controlled and skills are learned through the development of GMPs is all fine and good if we lived in a world where conditions never changed and the constraints imposed on us are artificially reduced like in most lab experiments. But we don't. GMP theory assumes that performance will always happen in a narrow set of contexts for which the optimal parameters are known. But in reality, we must behave in a world in which we can face an almost infinite number of possible contexts, determined by the combination of factors like weather, the behavior of our opponents, and internal processes like fatigue. Even if we do assume that behavior is deterministic, that is, the same situation always leads to the same outcome, in the real world, we rarely, if never, face the same situation. So part of the reason low movement variability has been championed in the past is due to the way that it has been studied using highly constrained and unnatural conditions. When we consider the wide range of possible contexts we need to perform in, motor control and skill acquisition cannot be determined by a simple set of programs, but are rather better conceived as a complex system, as described in the ecological dynamics approach. Behavior emerges based on the constraints faced by a performer in an adaptive process. It is not prescribed beforehand. Motor learning does not involve acquiring the correct expert movement pattern, but rather finding the best pattern based on the particular constraints faced by an individual performer in a particular context. From this perspective, movement variability is not detrimental, but is rather a direct consequence of this adaptation process in action. As I will discuss in more detail in a moment, variability in movement systems helps individuals adapt to the unique constraints of their environment. Another thing that is often ignored in GMP models is the concept of degeneracy. That is, the fact that we can use different structures to produce the same output. Or, put another way, we have the ability to vary motor behavior structurally without compromising function. In traditional approaches, this functional variability is a problem to be solved, again through reduction. That is, finding the one optimal technique to perform the action. In ecological dynamics, this variability in function presents a great opportunity, or the bliss of motor abundance, as Latache calls it. Another reason why movement variability gets a bad rap is due to the way it's defined and analyzed in most research. I agree, of course, that when we consider just movement outcomes, low variability is typically a good thing, especially when you're already performing at a high level. Low variability in performance outcomes is synonymous with consistency. But the assumption that you have to always produce the same movement pattern to achieve this is flawed. Movement variability can be generally defined as variance in movements generated by an individual under the same task conditions. If a person performs the same movement twice, it will not be identical, so we have variance. Variability can be divided into three types. Inter-trial variability, which is the type of variability focused on by GMP backers, like my esteemed opponent today. That is, the difference in movement that occurs when we look across a series of trials or attempts of the same skill. For example, from the beginning to the end of a practice session. The second type is intersubject variability, which again my opponent described when talking about differences in technique and expert models of behavior. This is the difference in movement between individual performers at a particular skill level. In the ecological dynamics approach, intersubject variability is a good thing, because it means that the emergent behavior is adapted for each performer's own individual constraints. And of course, we do see some unusual and orthodox techniques quite often in sports. This issue was discussed back in episode 20E. Inter-trial and intersubject variability are analyzed using the discrete analysis techniques most researchers know and love. That is, calculating a discrete value like the variance or standard deviation of a movement outcome, for example, the final position of a thrown ball, or some kinematic variable, for example, the maximum elbow velocity. Here you're taking a complex behavior that is unfolding across time and reducing it to a set of small discrete numbers. But we need to be careful when looking at averages and standard deviations and using discrete statistics to describe movement. When they are the same across two cases, it would seem to reflect stability, but they could actually be the result of very different underlying processes. For example, the same standard deviation value could result from a completely noisy and random process, or one that changes systematically over time. I've included a diagram in the show notes which illustrates this effect. Discrete analyses also remove all effect of order. For example, if we just calculate the standard deviation of elbow angle, it does not matter whether the angle is bigger at the beginning or the end of a pitching delivery. In other words, the structure of the variability is ignored. As shown in studies like Bootsma, examining table tennis players, and Lee and colleagues examining long jumpers, it can often be the case that elite performers have high variability in the early stages of a movement, like the beginning of a paddle stroke or the run-up to the long jump board. This is again completely expected in the ecological dynamics approach, as a result of functional variability. We do not need to use the same prescribed program of movement to produce the outcome we want. These studies further show that at the critical endpoint of the movement, variability is low. That is, the foot always hits the board at roughly the same spot, and the racket angle is almost always the same. So, it's not just the overall variability that is critical, we need to consider its structure. These examples illustrate the final type of variability that is completely ignored by GMP theorists and by traditional statistics used in research: intra-trial variability. That is, differences in movement behavior that occur within a single, individual attempt at the skill. For example, how does the elbow angle change during a single delivery by a baseball pitcher? Intra-trial variability must be analyzed using a completely different statistical approach, specifically some form of time series analysis. A good example of the importance of looking at intra-trial variability can be seen in the study of swimming technique by Seifert et al. Published in 2011. In this study, 24 recreational and 24 expert swimmers, as defined by their times, not their technique, were asked to do a breaststroke under identical conditions. That is, each participant swam 25 meters at 80% of their maximum individual speed. The elbow and knee angles of the swimmers were measured using an underwater video camera. In particular, the goal was to look at the coordination between the arm and leg movements by measuring the continuous relative phase of the limbs. Relative phase in this context refers to the synchrony of the limb movements. If I extend my leg at the exact same time I extend my arm, my movements are perfectly in phase. Conversely, if I extend my leg at the exact moment I contract my arm, my movements would be perfectly anti-phase. And of course, I could produce movements that fall anywhere between these two extremes. The key here is that we don't reduce the phase to a single measurement in our analysis, but rather measure it continuously throughout a single movement, in this case a single swim stroke. What was found in this study? I've included a figure in the show notes which shows the general results. During one stroke, the relative phase began completely anti-phase, then went to in-phase and back to anti-phase for all swimmers. As predicted by GMP theory, intersubject variability within the recreational group, that is comparing the relative phase across swimmers, was much higher than the variability within the expert group. But there was more to that than just noise or error. A follow-up or cluster analysis revealed that this higher variability resulted from the fact there were actually 3 distinct coordination groups within the recreational swimmers, likely reflecting different stages of skill acquisition. For example, one of the groups used highly in-phase motion throughout most of the stroke. This likely reflects a case of freezing degrees of freedom, that is, moving the arms and legs in the same way to simplify the movement. If we had done discrete analyses of these data, we would have completely missed the different patterns and would have masked the underlying functional variability. The swimmers in the recreational group had high variability not because they were error-prone or their movements were noisy, they were adapting their behavior differently as a function of their skill level. The results from this study also provide a good example of degeneracy, as different patterns of movement in the recreational swimmers produce the same functional outcomes in terms of lap times. Functional variability can also be seen in experts. A good example of this was the flight simulator study conducted by Hue and colleagues in 2011. In this experiment, novice and expert pilots were asked to land under a variety of different visual conditions. For example, in some instances there was texture on the ground, others there was not. Some the horizon was visible, others there was not. The main measure used was the variability of the flight path around the ideal landing glide slope of 3 degrees. What was found? In several of the conditions, the glide slope variability around the ideal slope was actually higher for experts than novices, particularly at the start of their approach. Further analyses revealed that what was happening is experts were moving the aircraft up and down to create additional perceptual information to help them with the approach, acting to perceive rather than perceiving to act. So again, the high level of variability of movement was functional in that it served to enhance perception. But you might say, if variability is so good, then why do we frequently get this pattern of lower inter- and intra-trial variability in expert performers, as was seen in the swimming study described a few moments ago? Well, I would argue that rather than being indicative of the true nature of perceptual motor control, this effect is simply a reflection of the most commonly used coaching methods. Traditionally, coaches have emphasized linear methods, That is, having a learner repeat the skill under a very restricted set of conditions until they learn the ideal model form or technique, and being able to repeat this optimal movement pattern over and over. Given this approach, it's not surprising that we get a lot of athletes that have highly similar patterns of movement at the end of training, or in other words, low intersubject variability. The alternative non-linear approach to coaching, which emphasizes the athlete coming up with their own technique by being exposed to a wide range of environmental constraints, is relatively new. A good example of this effect can be seen in a recent study by Busquets and colleagues published in 2016. In this study, 131 male gymnasts were observed while performing long swings. There were 3 different skill levels: beginner, intermediate, and advanced. Similar to the Seifert et al. Swimming study, the main analysis involved looking at the coordination between different body segments. For example, the arm and trunk and thigh and trunk. Based on the idea of functional variability, it was predicted that coordination variability would be high in beginners, as they explore different ways that the action can be performed, get smaller in intermediate performers as they begin to settle into a movement solution, and then increase again in experts as they attempt to modify and enhance their skill by making small adjustments. In other words, using functional variability. All of this should produce a U-shaped function when we look at variability across different levels of expertise. What was found? Of this 18 variability measures, there were only 2 that showed the predicted U-shape: the hip maximum closed angle during downswing and the maximum closed angle during the upswing. The more common pattern observed was the one predicted by GMP theory, and expected as a result of the common linear coaching methods used. That is, a systematic decrease in variability as skill level increased. So, to summarize, the bad name variability as received in the motor control and skill acquisition literature is in a large part a reflection of the narrow range of environmental conditions studied, the use of discrete analysis methods, and the lack of consideration of the structure of variability. Furthermore, the tendency for expert performers to exhibit low movement variability is a reflection of restrictive, linear coaching methods rather than being an inherent property of motor control. Variability serves a functional purpose. In fact, it may be better to name it adaptability, as it is a reflection of movement being fit to the constraints of the environment in which it is being performed. Variance in movement patterns within the execution of a single skill, across executions of the skill, and between performers should be encouraged by providing opportunities for it to occur in practice. Thank you, low and high variability, for compelling cases. It's time for the jury to deliberate and come to a decision. So what do you think? Court adjourned. I hope you enjoyed seeing variability put on trial. I'll be talking in more detail about some of these concepts in the future, like motor abundance and nonlinear coaching methods. I also wanted to mention something new and exciting that I have coming soon. Another podcast. This one will be called Ultra Running Science and Superstitions. As the name implies, I'm going to be focusing exclusively on running in that one. It will include discussion of scientific research in the area, race reports, challenging some conventional wisdom, and a lot more. You'll be able to find it on my regular website, perceptionaction.com. As always, you can contact me via email, robgray@asu.edu, follow me on Twitter @ShakyWeights, and find all the information about this podcast at perceptionaction.com. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now.